I'm now at the second part of this lecture, which is genocide. This lecture does tend to be a little longer because it takes up finally, and it sort of brings together many of the issues that we have been looking at over the last, well, really few weeks now. At genocide, if the core part of atrocity, to take this on, then if the core part of atrocity is the needless killing of human beings, then the wanton killing of whole races, the deliberate killing of whole races or cultural groups, which we call genocide, is also certainly not a good thing, we suppose. Again, it depends on your point of view, right? I mean, you're going to say, well, no, let's wipe them out. The striking fact about Dresden is that everything went exactly as the planners at Bomber Command wanted it to. So, was that a genocide? Was that planned? I mean, after all, it was planned, you know. Was it the attempt to wipe out, a whole race? Well, no, because not every German, not every surviving German was living in Dresden. But it was a resounding success. And compared to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bombings of Japan at the end of the war, which ended the war basically, it was cheaper and it was far more deadly. Um, and Freeman Dyson, who was a Nobel Prize winning mathematician, was a young man working at Bomber Command between 1943 and 1945. And he has written a number of books about weapons and of his memoirs, which are all fascinating. I'm going to draw here from his 1979 memoir, Disturbing the Universe, which is a very thoughtful, reflective, quiet, damning book. Okay. And at Bomber Command in England, this is where this new science of strategic bombing was being tested, specifically at the Witten airfields, which is where Dyson worked. And this is where the Lancaster bombers, which were these early, they weren't the big super bombers that you're going to get by the end of the war, the B-29s, B-27s, B-29s. But these were much smaller craft, and they just came apart in the air. I mean, they just couldn't take that many hits. I mean, yeah. So at the Witten airfields, this is where many of the Lancaster bombers, like Memphis Belle, which is a very famous one. It was the first bomber. To give you an idea, I can't remember how long they'd been flying. At least a year, and the number of missions that a bomber had to fly was 25 for the aircrew to retire. Essentially, if you flew 25 missions, you could go home. That was the promise. And this is at the heart of Catch 22, right, where they're promised, okay, and then they start raising the number of missions, which did happen towards the end of the war. But at this point, if you got to 25 missions, you were allowed to go home. One bomber at this point was going to have successfully flown 25 missions without being shot down, basically, and all its people killed. And that was the Memphis Belle. And there's a really well done movie about it because it was a Canadian. It was a Canadian. My memory is that it was a Canadian crew. Yep. And this is where Dyson was working, basically, at the Witten airfields. And Dyson, who was a pacifist then and a pacifist now, writes in his memoir, his 1979 memoir, we killed together about 400,000 Germans, one-third of them in two firestorms in Hamburg and Dresden. The Dresden firestorm was the worst, but from our point of view, it was only a fluke. We attacked Berlin 16 times with the same kind of force that attacked Dresden once. We were trying every time to raise a firestorm. There was nothing special about Dresden except that for once, everything worked as we intended. It was like a hole-in-one in a game of golf. So the problems with creating a firestorm, like why would a mathematician be involved? It's like because you got to have the statistics right. You've got to know, you got to be able to group the bombs. You got to have the flyers. You got to have the aircraft in the sky at the right time over the um, objective, the target, at the same time. They have to drop the bombs in a certain pattern. Things have. It's very, very. It's very, very complex. So the problem, as I say, with creating a firestorm is that it requires precision bombing. It requires the right ground conditions. Not to have rained recently. It has to be the right geography, and so on. You have to have incendiary bombs, which are basically incendiary bombs are like big tanks of oil that you drop, and they have inside them explosives. So the tanks of oil, it depends on how they're designed, but they're variously designed. Some blow open and basically spread oil all over the place. Then the incendiaries go off and light the oil on fire. Or they explode from the inside, light the oil on fire, and burning oil covers everything. It's the same idea. And it's more than basically just dropping high explosives, HE as it's called. Okay, so yeah, all right. So let me give you an idea of what is happening, basically, because Vonnegut gives you, he is a survivor, right? So now it's going to become evident just how odd it is and strange it is that anybody survived, let alone, ironically, Allied prisoners of war. That these allies are being bombed by their own people, and that they survived. Okay, so this is taken from a book. I am not kidding you. The book is called Flame On, and it's a history of incendiary weapons by a guy named John Mountcastle. And so this is a discussion of what is happening to Hamburg on the ground. And what happens to Hamburg is pretty much what happens to Dresden. So as Dyson says, they did most of the killing in these two sort of fluke incidents, one in Hamburg, one in Dresden. And a firestorm tends to be a firestorm. The thing looks like the thing. So this is what happens in Hamburg, and you can sort of translate this to this is also what happened in Dresden. The first British Pathfinder aircraft began dropping large flares and incendiary markers on the target, the shipyards, shortly before midnight. Because they're after, in the case of Hamburg, Hamburg is an industrial city. It's making war material. They're like, we're after it, and we want to wipe it out. But Dresden, remember, is an open city, right? No war industries there. Okay, so they begin to drop markers. The flares started by the Pathfinders were burning and provided effective markers when the main force arrived over the target at 1 a.m. on 28 July. The loads carried by the Lancaster and Wellington bombers were composed of HE high explosives and incendiary bombs of various sizes. So a whole bunch of different, but they're all full. Right? These aircraft are full of bombs. The fires that sprang from the incendiaries fed on the dry buildings in the city and grew to such an intensity that there developed in Hamburg what came to be called a firestorm. The Führersturm, this is the German pretty much straight translation of it, was caused by the intense heat generated by the burning city. So what you want to do is get the city burning, and then the burning city just becomes a big fire, a big bonfire. But it has, because it's so massive, it has its own physics. Right? There was little surface wind that night, and the great mass of superheated air rising from the growing conflagration, which just means fire, rushed upwards at a great speed. So what we have is, we've got, if you can imagine, say, a fire on you've probably seen a bonfire somewhere. I hope you haven't seen a city on fire, but you probably have seen a bonfire. And it starts to get big, and the flames start to reach up. And what's happening is, as the flames reach up, is that down at the bottom of the fire, there's not a lot of oxygen left to burn. There's still fuel, probably, but there's not a lot of oxygen. So air starts to come in from the surrounding around. So let's say you're on a beach somewhere, it's night, and you've got a bonfire going. sitting at the fire is going to be both hot and cold, right? Because you've got the intense heat of the fire on your, say, the front of you, but behind you, it's like it's getting cool. It's getting cool because cool air is rushing in from around you to feed the bottom of the fire, and there's plenty of it, right? There's a beach full of it, so this cool air is being drawn in more and more to the base of the fire, and it's being burned. The air is being burned there because the air has to mix with the fuel, and the fire goes higher, right? And it gets hotter. Okay, so there's little surface wind that night, and great mass superheated air rising from the growing country rushed upward at great speed. A vacuum resulted at the base of the fire. Into this void poured cooler air from the surrounding areas. Now, what they mean by surrounding areas is basically like what we would now call the suburbs, right? Into this void, okay, winds of hurricane force developed as the air rushed through the streets of Hamburg to fuel the fire. So what happens is the streets now become tunnels essentially for the air, because if you've got a bonfire out on the beach, the air can get to it from anywhere. So you can feel it. You might feel a draft around the fire, but you don't have only a few places. But in a city, you do, right? Because essentially you've set up big stone walls, which is what the city is, made of stones. The old buildings in Hamburg and in Dresden too, and they're channeling air into the city. So you've got these gale force winds are now rushing through these streets. The magnitude of the resulting inferno and the destruction it wrought have been documented by several German authorities at the scene. Okay, so what happens meanwhile is that the Germans kept, of course, great records. So did the Brits. And down at the bottom, this is what it looked like. So these are taken from the German officials reporting at the time. So these are people who survived and lived to write reports the next day. Police engineers in Hamburg estimated the temperatures in the burning city blocks went as high as 800 degrees Celsius, which is 1472 Fahrenheit. As you can see, it's hot. Literally hundreds of people were seen leaving shelters as the heat became intense. They ran across the streets and were seen to collapse very slowly, like people who were thoroughly exhausted. They could not get up. Many thus killed were found to be naked. The heat and flames destroyed all clothing except shoes, which is made of leather, right? Skin, right? Most of these people were not burnt to ashes when recovered, but were dry and shrunken, resembling mummies. In the shelters, bodies assumed various aspects corresponding to the circumstances under which death had set in. Bodies were frequently found lying in thick, greasy black masses, which was, without a doubt, melted fat tissue. Okay, so what you're dealing with is essentially being dried out. The people who get out, they leave the shelters, which they're told they're going to be safe in. From a typical bombing raid of high explosives, probably, especially with these deep bunkers that the Germans had. But from a firestorm, no, you have to get out. The only real guarantee of surviving a firestorm is to get away, or to be in water. But you have to also, you'd have to be submerged like if you're in a river, or a pond, a lake, you might survive it, as long as you don't get torn out of it by the winds that are blowing across it. Firestorms of this type, although on a smaller scale, developed in Dresden and Tokyo, which was burned by a firestorm. And so this is from Physicians for Social Responsibility, okay, because there are a number of, during and after World War II, a number of doctors came together and said, okay, we got to stop this. It's nuts. So this is from Physicians for Social Responsibility. They say the information gained from these experiences, these firestorms, particular relevance to the question of fallout shelters. In these earlier firestorms, only those who left the bomb shelters had any chance of surviving. Well, why, right? Those who remained in underground shelters were killed, roasted as their bunkers were turned into ovens, and suffocated as the fires consumed all the oxygen in the air. So the issue is the heat, but the heat is, one thing is going to kill you, the other, or both. but also you can't breathe. There's nothing left because the oxygen is being drawn out of the air. So what you're left with in these rooms is essentially a crematoria. All right. Well, we meanwhile have gone on. So you might think, well, thank God that's over, right? I mean, they only this only happened during World War II, and it hasn't happened since. It's like, except remember that in Vietnam, napalm was one of the most commonly used airdropped weapons. And napalm is designed to create a firestorm every time. And it's much more successful because the fire is already so hot. You don't have to wait, to start a city on fire. You don't have to try that. You drop enough napalm canisters, that's it. You automatically burn up all the oxygen on the ground, and you start one of these incredible pyres, basically. And the idea of this sort of, which is why Mount Castle's book is called Flame On. The idea there, and there's also a sort of a book which is a biography of napalm, which was published a few years ago, is that what if you could generate this in one shot? Like, what if you just like with one, like you'd have to drop a bunch of bombs and have them all land together, because this problem is still that you have to, depends on what the geography is like and whether there's a bowl. Like, is the city in a sort of bowl that's going to help, or is the target in a bowl? If it's on a plain, if it's on a mountaintop, and it's not going to work so well. It's probably not going to, if the bombers aren't in the right position and so on. Despite having much better targeting systems now than they did in the 40s, where the Norden bomb sight was sort of the incredibly important new thing. And it was a game changer. What we now have are called fuel air explosives, and fuel air explosives were in fact designed, were being designed before and leading up to the first Gulf War. And a fuel air explosive is a particular kind of weapon which works in one. Like, you just need one of these. They're massive bombs. They can be a couple of thousand pounds. And where a standard bomb now, a standard guided bomb unit, a GBU, is say 500 pounds, which is a lot, right? That's a lot. That's 500 pounds of high explosive packed in one thing, and you're just dropping it. So these can be 2,000 pounds of bombs, and they are pointed. They're organized in such a way that they punch through a series of layers of ground, and then they explode, right? So the idea is to target, the idea particularly in 1991 and then again in 2001 after the bombing of 9/11, was to create what were called bunker busters. So you don't want to have the thing hit the ground and just blow up. You want to have it hit the ground, punch through the ground, and then blow up inside the bunker. And when it blows up inside the bunker, you want to have a fire weapon blow up inside the bunker. You don't want to just have high explosive, because you want to get everything in the bunker. If it's a bunker complex, let's say there are tunnels that lead away from the bunker, you want to get all that too. So it's like a gopher warren. You want to flood it out, except with fire, right? So you use what are called fuel air explosives. And fuel air explosives are, and this next little GIF will show you, or GIF if you prefer. It's always good to say that to freak people out. Will show you basically what's happening. So let me show you this little GIF or GIF of what a fuel air explosive is and how it's designed. Okay, have a look at this. So you've now seen this what we're doing now, essentially, to do better than, because the whole thing about Dresden and Hamburg, as Dyson says, is it was a fluke. It's like, well, we don't want any more flukes, not from the West. They're like, no, 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 we got to make this work. So we want to have essentially a nuclear response, but without using nuclear weapons. Okay, how are we going to do that? We don't want to have hot ground at the end of it, not radioactively hot. Thermally hot, that's okay. It'll cool off. So fuel air explosives are your thing. However, going back to Dresden, Vonnegut is on the ground, right? And he describes the one flame ate everything organic, everything that would burn. It wasn't safe to come out of the shelter until noon the next day. And when the Americans and their guards did come out, the sky was black with smoke. The sun was an angry little pinhead. Dresden was like the moon now, nothing but minerals. The stones were hot. Everybody else in the neighborhood was dead. This is 178. And Vonnegut and Dyson have this interesting exchange where basically Dyson agrees with Vonnegut's description of what happened. But he says that the shame for Dresden falls on Britain, not on America. And that's part of this article or part of his memoir, Disturbing the Universe. And Vonnegut, however, knows that there's more than enough to go around. They actually had a correspondence where Dyson wrote to Vonnegut and said, that's really our problem. That's our blame to lift. And Vonnegut wrote back and said, that's very kind of you, but everybody's guilty, And he says this, right, on page 10. He told me about concentration camps and about how the Germans had made soap and candles out of the fat of dead Jews and so on. All I could say was, I know, I know, I know, on page 10.